We're really pleased today to have four real leaders across the globe in the aviation association world. And people always wonder, what do associations do? And so what we wanted to use this opportunity was to share with everybody here a little bit about the work of the associations across the globe and how we can really help make a difference in promoting aviation. So we're really fortunate to have four wonderful friends and partners who have helped make they and their members have helped make Montreal such a great success for us so far. And I'd like to welcome, first of all, and we're going to go in alphabetical order, my good friend and neighbor from the National Air Carrier Association, Oakley Brooks. I'd like to introduce to his left Simon McNamara, who now, how long have you been with as Director General of ERA?
4 months.
Just 4 months as the Director General of the European Regional Airlines Association. To my left is John McKenna, who is the President and CEO of the Air Transport Association of Canada. And at the far end is George Petsikis, who is the President of the National Airlines Council of Canada. So to get things started, what I'd like each of you to do, and this is always one of the hard things for me, is when you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your association, give the elevator speech so that somebody who's not in aviation would understand what the hell you do for a living.
Good. Well, I will. And of course, the question is, are we in a 3-story building or a 100-story building? But I'm going to say, I want to say something first. This is my 45th year coming to regional, it used to be Commuter Airline Association meetings. My first one was in Miami in September of 1968. And so I would turn to Simon and I say, Simon, how old are you?
40.
40, okay. So, Roger, it's really great of you to ask us to come. And we also, our National Air Carrier Association, have our other two staff members, George Paul and Paul Dole, who, with members from NACA, are doing joint council meetings, maintenance and operations and security council meetings here in Montreal. And it's an initiative that Roger wanted us to do. We're very happy to do it. It's worked out really well, and we're halfway through, but it's just been great. National Air Carrier Association is an organization based in Washington, D.C. We have 15 airline members. You have to be a Part 121 carrier in the United States to be a member. All of our companies except for one are privately held. Atlas is the only publicly held company. We're split pretty evenly between passenger carriers and cargo carriers, and we have 4 or 5 carriers that in fact do both passenger and cargo operations. I like to say our carriers are not big companies, they just fly big airplanes. So we fly all around the world, and from 737-800s to 75s, 76s, 777s, 747-400s, both in cargo, MD-11s, both in cargo and passenger. We've been carrying 95% of the military, the U.S. military traffic, and about half the cargo. And we'll get into other things as we go through, but some of our carriers are very small. They have 5 Hercs, and some of them are quite big, like Atlas. It has 747-800s. So that's who we are. We're charter carriers, but we have 2 scheduled carriers, Sun Country from Minneapolis and Allegiant in Las Vegas. But all the other carriers are non-scheduled supplemental charter carriers. So that's our elevator speech.
Simon.
Thanks, Roger. Yeah, so I'm introducing the European element here. So I'm Director General of an organization called the European Regions Airline Association, and it's basically, the best way to describe it is it's the European equivalent of the RAA. We have 51 airlines in membership, and collectively they transport about 72 million passengers throughout the European region. Typically they're flying aircraft average size of 72 seats. fleet of about 800 aircraft, 50-50 prop and jet. In terms of the membership, we also have associate members. We have about 120 associate members, and those are a lot of the suppliers that you see here today as well, people like Bombardier, Embraer, and ATR, as well as the many other suppliers and supporters to our business. And we do a lot of the things that the RAA does, which is trying to influence government policy in Europe at a central European level, both technical and non-technical. And we also run an annual event similar to this, where we bring our members together, and we have technical and non-technical committees that get our member experts together to talk about operations, maintenance, flight safety issues, along with many other things. So that's my elevator speech, Roger.
John?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Roger. I represent the Air Transport Association of Canada. We roughly have 170 members, half of which are operators and half of which are industry supporters. Our operators are in every region of Canada and go from large carriers to commuters to regionals to air taxis. You have to realize that about 35% of Canada's landmass is only reachable by plane, so air transport plays a vital role in this economy. So many of our carriers are lifelines to their communities. We operate through many committees, basically operations of all types. I mean, in fiscal committees, legal committees, commuter ops, technical ops, flight ops. That's how we interact with our members. This is what we do. Most of our work is based on content lobbying. In other words, getting the work done, putting out fires for our members, and being heads up on the regulatory changes of what's going on. We have an unparalleled network across Canada and the US, and we don't hesitate to speak on those issues that really affect our members. So that's a five-floor operator's elevator speech. I want to thank Roger for the opportunity to come and meet people and work with you, and we've been very happy to have participated. I have many of our officers are here in the hall, and they've participated in many of the committees, and we're very happy to do it.
We appreciate it. George?
Roger, thank you very much. As a born and raised and lifelong Montrealer, I'm delighted to see you, the RAA, all your delegates here in our in this great city, where I won't repeat obviously some of the stuff you heard this afternoon, but of course a great city to eat, drink, and have a great time. You may notice that some of the locals have a bit of a distressed, almost grief-stricken look on their faces. That's because our hockey team is trailing in their playoff series against the Ottawa Senators. Be patient with them. That'll be turned around very quickly as we speak. And
Tonight?
Yeah, well, we hope so, because hockey is a bit of a spiritual issue here in Montreal, as you know, so please be patient. The National Airlines Council of Canada was founded in 2008. It was founded by Canada's major commercial airlines, namely Air Canada, WestJet, Jazz Aviation, and Air Transat. We represent about 75% of the commercial airline activity in Canada. We are primarily focused on large network air operator operations, but we do have a bit of an eclectic mix again within our own membership, because we have one of the world's great international and domestic network airlines. We have one of the world's great low-cost carriers in WestJet, one of the world's great, as you know, regional airlines, and leisure holiday travel airlines in Air Transat. So that brings a lot of a different perspective as well to our table. We work together for three main reasons: to ensure a safe, cost-competitive, and environmentally sustainable air transport system in this country. And I think we've done a lot of good work in that respect in our very short time frame. While we were a little inwardly focused, we are outwardly focused now, because we work very well with other partners in the travel and tourism chain, and in fact have our co-founder of the National Travel and Tourism Roundtable here in Canada, where we work with our friends in tourism and the airports and the hotel sector, et cetera. So we're delighted to get the call from Roger to come and meet with you folks as well today, and we hope to be able to add to a little bit of interesting debate today.
Let me kick it off by stealing a question from another association head, a good friend of mine, Chip Barkley, who runs the AAAE, the Airport Executives Association. And let me throw it out there. What's the thing that keeps you up at night the most? John?
Well, basically a government that doesn't recognize the fact that our industry is a socioeconomic enabler and doesn't help us do our mandate properly. That's what keeps me awake at night.
Oakley?
The thing that keeps me awake, frankly, is the ability of our airlines to survive in a worldwide environment. They did a lot of work. There was the U.S. government, when we had the two wars, were spending about $4 billion a year on transport of soldiers and Marines and airmen, as well as cargo. And that's going to go down to somewhat under $300 million this year. And after we stop the activity in Afghanistan, it's going to go down to just about nothing. And so that's been very good business for our carriers for the last 10 years. And in the civilian, the commercial business, it's as those of you who are in the cargo business or read about it know, worldwide air cargo continues to be either flat or down. And on the passenger side, all of those scheduled passenger carriers have figured out ways to offer very, very low fares. And that always was the backbone of the charter passenger group. So I think it's amazing, frankly, how these operators continue to survive as they do and thrive. And there's just one thing. It's just the entrepreneurship of the people that run these airlines. I'm amazed by it every day. But that's what keeps me awake, is how are these guys going to come up with the next piece of business? They seem to, but that's a tough one.
Simon, you probably got the hardest job, because most of us only have to deal with one or two governments. In your job, you deal with,
Well, we have 25 governments plus a central European regulator, and it's become a horrific regulatory machine in Europe. And I think the sort of thing that keeps me awake at night is actually very similar to what's just been said. It's the same thing. It's how do we as a business end up in this situation where, in Europe at least, and it's the same here in North America, we operate in a dog-eat-dog competitive environment where the margins are tiny, absolutely tiny. We're thrust upon by regulators who add cost and complexity to our business. We have growing uncontrollable costs, and I'm sure we'll talk about them later, things like ATM, fuel, and so on. But worst of all, from our perspective as an association, it's governments who don't believe and understand in what we do. And what keeps me awake is how, as we as trade association, can convince those governments that they need to do something to support our business. And in Europe, at least, amongst the regulatory environment and the regulators, aviation is not seen as a economic enabler, as something that can drive the economy forward. And frankly, it's seen as something of an inconvenience, which is very sad, I think, because aviation has a huge amount to contribute, and particularly our members, which Europe, it's a big continent, and a lot of our members are providing essential links from the regions, from the periphery of Europe into the core, feeding those hubs, feeding the international flights. So it's a very important business for social and economic development. So the thing that vexes me is how do we support those members, and how do we keep them going in the environment in which they are now?
We're coming off of kind of a little bit, as my opening remarks talked about, we're coming off of a little bit of a sugar high here in our industry here over the last couple of weeks because of the great success we had on the controller furloughs. Can you, if that same situation were to have happened, let's say in Canada, do you think your government would have responded the same way, turning it around overnight like that?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, as you know, air traffic control is managed differently in Canada than it is in the U.S. It's not a government function. It's operated by NAV Canada, which is at arm's length. No, I think clearly that if you were looking at the shutdown of the industry, Canada is the second largest landmass in the world, 28th largest population. Clearly, without air transport, we'd have a problem. But And if I may, you're talking about before about what keeps you up. The problem we have in Canada is we have what I call policy complacency by our government, almost an unwillingness to act in terms of developing strategic aviation policy unless the house is burning down. That's the only time we see governments acting sometimes, and I think that's a little bit what happened there too. That's really not the way to do it. We would much prefer to build on positive policy platforms. We talked about aviation as a huge enabler for the national economy, trade and commerce. Why does it take so long? Why is it so hard to get people, government policymakers, to sit there and say, aha, you got a point. Let's do something that makes you guys even better at what you do. I'm not sure, but I think we have to find a way to become part of the political equation for government, because one of the problems you have is that I don't think a lot of governments lose sleep. A lot of politicians lose sleep at night if they go to bed saying, well, did I really upset the airlines today or not? And is that going to lose me some votes? Probably not. Good night. We have to change that dynamic, and we have to be part of the political equation and success in terms of how we help the greater economy, and why people say, yeah, it matters to me that aviation succeeds and helps the greater economy succeed, which is of interest to me.
Simon, you were going to...
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on that. If you have a big crisis that shuts the system down, we had that situation back in 2010 in Europe with the Icelandic volcano that some of you, I'm sure, heard of, where European airspace was shut for all intents and purposes for a week. The whole system shut down. Millions of people stranded, goods and services couldn't flow. And the reaction of governments was very weak, actually. Yep. They didn't do a lot. They weren't shocked by it. And I think one of the problems of our business is actually what Oakley mentioned. It's a very, very resilient business. It's a very entrepreneurial business. So no matter what gets thrown at it, it survives. And guess what? The system shut down for a week. It restarted, and it carried on. It restarted. We got everyone back on their feet, got people back home, and the business has carried on. A few airlines went bankrupt. Well, it doesn't matter, who cares, sort of thing is the attitude of governments. The system keeps going because it's resilient, because it's entrepreneurial. And the one thing that came out of the volcanic eruption in Europe was, how do we prepare for that better? One of the conclusions by European regulators was we need to bolster and intensify the high-speed rail network in Europe, just in case the air system shuts again, so we have an alternative, So the attitude is not that we should protect our own business, and I think that's the mindset that we need to change.
I really feel for you, because one of the things that I noticed about that not only did the system shut down, that the government didn't do anything, that they penalized the airlines for delaying the passengers,
Yeah,
and that it was actually quadruple jeopardy.
Yeah.
That just incredible for us. So again, Simon, our hearts go out to you, for that. Obviously, is there any common theme as to why government doesn't show us the love? Are we showing them the love?
Well, we don't bring in any votes.
Yeah.
We don't, we've been complaining about airport rents, about high taxes, about the fact that we have the highest security fees in the world here, and they don't listen, because when they go to Walmart, nobody grabs them and says, what are you doing to the airlines? What are you doing? They don't care. So even if they did anything we wanted, everything we wanted, they wouldn't bring in an extra seat in the house. So we don't count. So it's very difficult to be an effective lobbyist when you've got an audience that really, feels oh-hum about what you're doing. They want to be able to fly home on Friday nights, but beyond that, I don't think that we really exist.
We had pick up again, George, what you said. We have a new chairman of the what's called the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in the House of Representatives. Good guy, Bud Schuster, father, same basic position. And after 3 or 4 years of not getting what we call an FAA reauthorization bill, we got an FAA reauthorization bill last year. So the new chairman of the committee, because they have term limits, his mantra is, okay, did it for the airlines, now let's work with somebody else for the next 4 years. So here you have the chairman of the House committee who's in charge of this, and he's just because we got an FAA reauthorization bill, he said, you guys are on your own for the next 4 years. I'm going to worry about roads and canals and water and pipeline. So he's one of the two more important people in the United States Congress, but we still come back to that resiliency. The people in this room and elsewhere, you do your job too well. You just survive and you prosper. My first RAA in 1968, everybody was saying, we're going to get just stomped by the big guys. We're trying to get joint fares. They don't want to give us joint fares. We're going to be out of business next year. And how many times over the years it changes, the people sit around, the operators and the RAA and everything say, Jesus, how are we going to get out of this one? But you do, and you survive, and the big guys do also. You know, they get through bankruptcies, they get through bad times, and they survive. How do they raise the money they raise? How many times have we sat in these organizations and said, well, there's going to be no more money for buying airplanes? I mean, it goes on and on. So it's that entrepreneurship. I don't want to say we don't need government. Of course, it'd be nice if they were better to us. But I don't think it should ruin our day. I mean, you know, what we do is to try to make things as good as possible. That's what we do on this table.
And we have microphones, so anybody who wants to ask a question, just, you know, stand up and identify yourself and have at it. Let me get to something that is the real reason why we have an RAA, we have all of our associations, and that's to promote safety, to make sure this industry is as safe as it is. And knock on wood, around the globe, we're in the safest period known to man. What do you think has been the reason for that safety record? And more importantly, what do we need to do to keep it going? George?
Well, listen, I mean, I think we've shown as an industry that you know, we are laser focused on certain key pillars. As I said, the NACC certainly has been one that works well together. Competitors working well to share and to work towards common objectives and goals. And on the safety front, we have said this is something that we don't compete on, obviously. This is something where we openly and freely share information amongst competitors in order to make sure that we all operate the safest system possible in Canada, in the world. You know, we've been strong supporters of SMS in this country. In fact, my airline, Air Transat, who I work for, was really the pioneer, if you will, in the early 2000s. We worked closely with government. We believe that it introduces a brand new safety culture, top down to the industry, to the organization. We've seen tremendous results in our organization. I can't speak for our other partner airlines, but of course those translate into the best statistics practically in the world, and as you mentioned, the U.S. as well, the great records we're showing on that. So I mean, we're working very closely with government on that and being very proactive in terms of making those solutions work.
Now, the airline industry doesn't need government to tell them to be safe. It needs government to help them facilitate safety. And that's what we need. We need for them to work with us, not slap our wrist, but work with us to help us improve. Share the knowledge and work as a team rather than strictly as an overseer.
Simon, the safety regime in Europe obviously a little bit different. And is there anything, and we obviously work very closely across North America, is there anything you can share that either your operators, your governments are doing to help, you know, promote that we could learn from here?
I mean, I don't think so specifically, because there's always been a good relationship, you know, between the FAA in particular and the European counterparts, the European Aviation Safety Authority. A lot goes on. But I think we often knock regulators, and actually in safety, regulation has worked quite effectively at making sure we are safe. But I think the other point is we don't need those to be safe. And I think the other thing that's worked in our favor to be so safe is a constant focus on safety, an ability to separate safety from commercial. And that's something very unique to our business as well, to keep that total concentration on that. And also technology, I don't think we should ignore that. There's been a lot of advances recently in technology over the last 15, 20 years that have meant safety has continued to improve. I think looking forward, one of the focuses has to be on human beings and human factors, and which will grow an increasing role in driving air safety and making sure we actually stay safe as a business.
Let me,
You can-
yeah, well, I just want to say from the U.S. standpoint, and I've seen it from the local level into the Washington level. I just think that the most amazing thing over the last, say, 10 or 15 years, where the number of accidents just went down precipitously, that the partnership between the industry and FAA has, I think, really been quite extraordinary, because the whole approach has changed from, okay, we got an accident, how are we going to prevent it, to what's going on out there that we can pick up clues that we may get an accident someday. How can we, and that's a vast system of data that has been developed, that these industry government teams spend weeks in a given year with 5 or 6 meetings of 2 days apiece, poring over the data, just combing through it to anticipate things. And that, I think has been the last, say, 10 years. Nick Sabatini at the FAA was just led the charge on that. And it's just trying to anticipate. So I mean, to answer your question, it's that shift to trying to anticipate, which comes out of data, which comes out of work, and it's proving to be successful. It didn't just happen.
The separation of our FAA obviously operates both the air traffic control system and the safety system. The events of the recent past have reignited and rekindled an ongoing debate in Washington, and I think you're going to see it going forward for the next several months and years, that there is now a widespread consensus amongst all of the stakeholders that we need perhaps to take the air traffic control system out of the government so that it is funded and operated similar to a NAV Canada. And so what's been the best thing about NAV Canada, and what's been the worst thing about the experiment?
Well, look, I mean, one of the best things has been that we as the industry have direct input in terms of the governance of the system right now. For example, NAV Canada is what we call a commercialized not-for-profit model, which basically means it runs like a private company but has no shareholders and is not there to make any money, just reinvests anything it makes back into the system. That's led for much more efficient management, much more responsive management to the needs and the dynamics of the sector that you wouldn't get, of course, in a government setting. And as I mentioned before, the governance model is one which works, I would say, very well for us because, again, the NACC, for example, names 4 of the 15 directors on the NAVCAN board. That gives us the direct ability to make sure that, we all agree that, of course, we maintain the highest levels of safety standards, and, of course, government will play its role and continue to play its role in terms of regulator of standards. But in terms of delivering the product, we have a direct input, and I think it's one of the most cost-efficient deliveries that you'll get in terms of ANSPs around the world. So, John Crichton, the CEO, owes me a drink for that, but I think it's worked actually fairly well.
What's been the worst thing about it?
Well, actually, we don't have many complaints about NAV Canada. We are concerned that they have to make ends meet. So, are always concerned when there's a downturn in the economy. We're saying, where are they going to up the fees because they can't run a deficit. But so far, that's proven to be not the case in the last few years. So we're very happy about that. So we have no gripes to pick with them at this point. I mean, they listen to industry. We have input. We always complain about sometimes the lack of the speed that we need, new approaches, we need things done, and they have to work within the system. We are concerned by the speediness of delivery once in a while, but as a rule, it's been a positive experience.
We've spent a lot of time here over several conventions, and probably one of the top priorities of the RAA member airlines has been the issue of supply of pilots. Mechanics, obviously, we have a shortage, I think. So it is something that we're focused on, supply of pilots. What's been the experience both in Europe, and how do you see the issue, and just north of the border in Canada. So, Simon?
Well, I think in Europe, I've not worked in the business as long as Oakley, clearly, but I have worked in the business for 18 years. And in that time, I've heard lots of talk about shortages of pilots, shortages of maintenance people, but it's never actually happened. It's never transpired to be a problem that it's been talked up to be. So I don't see the problem reaching crisis point. I think there'll always be debate about supplies of pilots and maintenance personnel. I suspect maintenance personnel is going to be a bigger problem in the future in Europe for sure. And I think one of the problems is that we're not selling the business in Europe enough to people coming out of school, university. The business is not as attractive as it used to be. People are going to IT, financial services and other things. I think we need to start at that level as well to make the business more attractive. But I don't see it being a crisis because, touch wood, it hasn't become a crisis yet, but it will always be a talking point for sure.
We're concerned. We're very concerned by the fact that there doesn't seem to be any succession planning in this industry. When the big guys, to my left, decide that they just raid the regional, they raid the smaller ones, and you know, we've seen carriers lose half their pilots in 2 months, half their captains in 2 months. This is really devastating for a company. So we're trying to set up some kind of dialogue so there can be more planning in this way. We had a recession a couple of years ago, like 2008-9, that up until then we'd been talking about shortages, and that sort of like killed that for a while. But unfortunately, it also drove a lot of people away from our industry. And considering the time it takes to train a pilot, we're going to be suffering from that in the short or longer term. Another issue we have to address is that we're not attracting women in our industry. 50% of the workforce.
Even though we've got the International Aviation Association of Women here, and so identify yourselves, ladies.
No, I mean, I admit that those that we have are fantastic, mind you, but we need a lot more. They represent 50% of the workforce, and we barely have 10% of them in our industry. Imagine in what great shape we'd be if we had more of them. So we need to work at that. We need to address that. And we need to make sure that there's greater dialogue between the smaller carriers, the regional carriers, and the greater carriers in order to plan this out. Because right now, the guys who are paying for the training and paying for the basic groundwork training are seeing their turnover as a very, very high turnover. It's very, very costly to them. So yes, I don't think the big guys are feeling the crunch yet, but because they're feeding off the smaller guys. But eventually, that's going to dry up too. We also need to become more competitive in our industry, in our salaries, in the time it takes to train somebody to join our industry, because we're losing people to other industries who can get good paying jobs at half the time that it takes to train a pilot or a mechanic. And we're saying we've got to address those issues.
Roger, can I ask John and George, go back to the business of the air traffic control system. One of the problems in the United States, part of the debate is user fees. You know, there are just a lot of people who don't like user fees. And what's been the experience? So, and if you could refresh me and maybe others, how long have you had this organization, and what's been the experience with the user fees?
Well, NAVCAN was created in 1996. Prior to that, the ATC was run by the government, as it is currently in the US. It was financed by what we call the air transportation tax. When they abolished it, it was about $55 a passenger. By far, they were over-recovering, you know, what they needed to fund the system. And they were not investing in new technology, so the system was getting ground down. Obviously, what happened is that we phased from a pass-through tax to the passenger onto an on-the-balance sheet charge for the airlines, because now we shifted to user fees. That was tough at first, but I know that at the beginning, the industry recovered through what we call the air navigation service fees that we tacked on to some other fees and charges that now has become blended into the overall price, because we have, you know, all-in pricing, so you don't see it anymore. But as a general rule, it hasn't helped, you know, to have that on the balance sheet. But, you know, there are trade-offs, and the trade-offs are that the system, we believe, is one of the most efficient ones in the world. And as I mentioned before, there are ways that we participate, which is great in terms of decision-making. And for now, you know, we've been able to absorb it as we've had. It's not, like I said, ideal, but it's better than it was before.
Let me follow up on that, and then I want to get to talk about the European experience on this. But when you went to the NAVCAN model in 1996, usually for government to act, as you said, it takes a crisis, something, or an individual or some catalyst to make it happen. What was the catalyst in Canada?
Well, unfortunately, and I don't mean to disappoint you on this, but it was nothing more vulgar than just reducing the federal deficit. The government at the time was completely focused on reducing the deficit, and what happened is that they looked at things such as the air transport system, airports, which were run by government, the air navigation service system, and they basically said, does government have to be in there, yes or no? Don't cloud my head with whether or not it's more efficient if it's in there or not, or what the impact on the industry is in terms of cost competitiveness. Does government have to deliver this? And the answer at the time was no, government didn't have to. So they said, good, take it away. Now, I've spoken about the ANS model, the Air Navigation Services model, which has worked okay, but obviously you have the other side of the coin, which is the airports model, which has been a mixed bag, and we work with the airports here, and we have a good relationship, but we've had our problems with major increases in airport fees and charges because of the fact that airports took over these assets through local authorities, and they started building away in huge capital development projects, and guess what? Government didn't put a dime in there. It's all recovered through user charges. That has been the tough part of the story in terms of, this shift away from government.
Simon, tell us about the European experience.
Yeah, well, ATM in Europe is not really a happy story, frankly. It is huge fragmentation. We still have a system in Europe where every single country provides its own air traffic control. And if you think about the geographic area, and there's been studies done on this, there's actually not a great deal of difference between the US and Europe in terms of geographic area, in terms of movements and everything else. And yet we have, I think, 26 different providers of services in Europe, and you have one in the US. In Europe, it costs about 7 billion euros a year, which is broadly $7 billion with the exchange rate these days, just for en route air traffic control, which is passed on as fees to airlines. And there is huge duplication, huge added cost, but we don't seem to be able to get over that because of politics. Each country still wants to be able to provide services in its own sovereign airspace, so there's a lot of political issues to break down those borders. But we're getting there, but I suspect we're not getting there fast enough, and we're certainly not getting there fast enough for some of our operators. And depending on the type of airline and depending on your basic cost base, whether you're ultra low cost or conventional, en route air navigation fees are representing somewhere between about 4 and I've heard figures up to 20% of direct operating cost is ATM charges. So it's a really significant cost, and it's one of those uncontrollable costs in Europe that we as an industry don't have a lot of control over, and we need to start getting control over it.
Are you any closer to next gen than we are in the United States?
Well, next gen in Europe is this CESAR project, which I know next gen's a bit delayed. CESAR is a bit delayed, but we're getting there. But we're reaching a critical point in CESAR where we're heading towards deployment of actual new technology. So we've been going through a research and development phase. So now the test is coming, and one of the challenges in Europe is that implementing CESAR, a bit like implementation of next gen, will require a lot of investment. It will require investment both airborne and on the ground, and one of the big challenges now is what is the return going to be, and when is the return going to come? Because a lot of our airlines are saying, what is it we have to buy, when do we have to buy it, and what will the returns be? So I think CESAR is going to deliver products and technology that will make the system better. But what we're working on now is there a positive cost benefit to that, and over what period as well? And if it's a long-term payback, which it's likely to be, how can we overcome the upfront costs that both air navigation service providers and airlines are going to have to front up now to actually implement it and deliver it?
Oakley, you've been since you self-admitted you've been in the business the longest time. And I'm not going to ask you to name a name of somebody who was bad. But is there any one official, either elected or appointed in that time, that you thought, that comes to mind as really going above and beyond to champion the airline industry?
Roger, I was prepared for the question, and I still haven't come up with an answer because there are Jennings Randolph and the members of Congress who've been over the years, who did, who sponsored bills. There've been big names that either been union supporters or non-union supporters. I just don't look at it that way so much as and I said it before. Particularly, I think recently with the leadership that's been in place at the Federal Aviation Administration, and then down through the organization, we have our arguments, but they always seem to be trying to figure out a way to get there, to come to yes. As I say, we have our arguments and there's funding and all the rest of it, but there's just that attitude about let's make this thing safer and make it run better. And so that's an organization. But the people that have been there at the time, I mean, the current fellow Mike Werder, who I think just got put in an impossible situation the last month or two. But they're really good people and they work so hard. And we have other agencies in Washington that are so much the opposite.
Yeah.
It's not working to yes, it's working to no. And so I look at it, my answer to that is I can't think of an individual who really stands out, but I think the agency, the FAA, and the results are there. Knock on wood.
That's right.
Well, I thought about that question, and my answer was that there are hundreds of people out there who get it. The inspectors, many of them are very dedicated, devoted, work with us. Many do their best out in the field. Their leadership lacks a bit of vision and governance, but I think that we have a lot of people out there that really understand aviation and want to help us.
And anybody, feel free to ask our panelists any questions here. Let's do this. Let's go to kind of a rapid fire round here, and let me start with a couple of things that may not be on everybody's radar screen all the time. Will there be a global emissions trading system for emissions? Europe has been the leading the charge on this. There's been obviously a lot of debate, a lot of controversy about, should there be a global system or is Europe going to go its own way? Do you think there's going to be either a European trading system that spreads or a global trading system?
Well, we've sort of got this showdown happening now because Europe unilaterally imposed its system on the world, and then they backed down 2 or 3 months ago and actually exempted all international flights. And
but you're currently, can you explain, are the European carriers currently paying and involved in it?
They are. I mean, this is...
Why don't you explain that?
Yeah, this is sort of classic European regulatory behavior. We invent a scheme to regulate emissions, and we apply it to all flights. The international community says, no, we don't like that. The US, China, India saying, we don't like you regulating flights outside of Europe and trying to charge us for our emissions. So eventually, after a lot of brinkmanship, Europe steps back, and it steps back for international flights, but for intra-European flights, i.e. flights within Europe, we're still fully covered by the scheme. So yes, the answer is all of the airlines operating intra-European flights between European countries are still monitoring their emissions and will have to start offsetting them by buying carbon permits from this year. But all international flights outside of the EU do not have to for a period of 1 year up to the end of this year. And then, in theory, the European legislation flips back, and all carriers operating into Europe will have to comply. And the challenge has been put to ICAO to implement a system within a year. I don't think they will. Let's be honest, they might by then have devised a system, a technical system, but then the politics comes of trying to sell that to all, however many contracting states there are in ICAO, in excess of 150, I think. And that will take a lot of time because you can't just impose a regulatory environment that quick. So I think eventually we'll get there because it's an important priority, but not in the next 12 months.
Is there any price tag so far on what one of these trading things would be on an intra-European flight, or what the cost is going to be for one of the member carriers? Any kind of measurement that would, it gives everybody here at least an economy of scale of what we might be looking at?
Well, one of the problems is the European system is based on carbon permits, and you buy them on the market, and the price for various complex reasons has collapsed recently. So the actual cost is relatively low at the moment. It's about €4 a ton of carbon, and it's extremely low.
€4 for a ton
of carbon.
Yeah, it's down from 40.
Correct. So at its peak, it was about 30. When we first modeled it, back in terms of when the price was about €30, the numbers we were coming out at it would represent about 7% of operating costs, somewhere in that ballpark. And one would think in the future the price will go back up because Europe is determined to limit the supply of carbon permits. So I think one of the other complexities of the European system is actually the administration of it. And you have to monitor your emissions, report, you have to have it verified. It's a whole level of bureaucracy that, particularly for smaller carriers, adds a lot of cost and complexity.
Roger, if I may, as long as we talk about solving the issue of aviation emissions and climate change in terms of things like you said, carbon exchange systems, which are market-based mechanisms, okay? As long as we just keep the discussion on market-based mechanisms, taxes, fees, charges, we will never get a global solution to this problem. I'm convinced of that. Because then we run head-on into the broader issue of what they call CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities between the developed and developing emerging economies. And needless to say, that's bigger than just aviation. I am convinced that unless we start more of a debate and discussion which is more multidimensional, more comprehensive in terms of looking at things that IATA, of course, has proposed in the industry, improving operating efficiencies, air traffic control efficiencies. You know, we spoke about Cesar and NextGen. Those are huge components in this. I'd love to see single European sky happen in my lifetime. We're moving on performance-based navigation. All these things have to be part and parcel of a package that everybody can buy into, because if it's just MBMs, we're never going to get ICAO, we're never going to get a solution to this.
Yeah, you'll certainly not get the United States Senate to approve that.
Let me ask our Canadian friends, when you all complain about the U.S., and not for quoting, obviously. When you all complain, what's your biggest complaint about either dealing with the U.S. regulators, dealing with the U.S. government, U.S. companies? Do you see, is there a cultural difference? Does there anything that changes at the border? And that's just a question.
3 letters, DHS/TSA. Or CBP.
Yeah.
Take all the letters you like.
And let me just mention that the Cabinet Secretary Napolitano, who heads DHS in the United States, was planning on being here, had accepted our invitation to be our keynote speaker, and then obviously declined because of sequestration, because of the fear of, think about how this would have looked. We would have had the Cabinet Secretary here while maybe some of our people were stuck at the border waiting in line to get clearance through TSA or customs or whatever.
The problem
else.
we have, Roger, is very simple. Before 9/11, border control management and facilitation were concepts which coexisted on this continent. After 9/11, we all know that facilitation and that overall concept went out the window, and of course security trumped all, which we of course understood in Canada. We fully realized that was going to be part of the new reality. We need to rebalance the system again. We need to get border control authorities to understand that there's a major cost in putting the brakes on our ability to cross borders efficiently and to keep trade and commerce going. So clearly we hope that the Department of Homeland Security, with all the challenges you have, fiscal challenges and all, I mean, we need to do that. I mean, one of the things we've complained about for years is about the lack of pre-clearance resources at our airports in Canada. We love that. We're supporting Beyond the Border, which is that perimeter concept of continental security. We think that's fine, but we have to come to the table with the funding and with the idea that it's also about facilitating travel.
Question?
First, I'm declaring that I'm from government. I'm from the Government of Canada. I'm the Deputy Minister of Transport, and I just want to intervene in this debate about, in terms of what Canadians feel bad about the U.S. with the resounding, there's tons of irritants always in any kind of relationship, but fundamentally, this relationship is extremely good to both countries. We're making progress on border issues, and it's not a trade-off between security and facilitation. Has to be both. If recent events have shown it's not one at the expense of the other. And I just want to take this occasion to thank the United States for their undying support of ICAO staying in Montreal. These are small issues, but in the bigger issues, there's an ongoing, very strong collaborative relationship with the United States and Canada.
Second that.
One last thing, just quick yes or no, and it might be something that puts us all out of business. Do you think in 20 years, or maybe 10 years, that there will be unmanned vehicles flying, UAVs, call them what you wish, flying in commercial airspace and or flying commercially with passengers on them, let's say in 50 years? Yes or no, George?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say John's out of space more than I am, so he'll know. But
Yes?
Absolutely.
Yes?
Yes, I think so, especially for freight, sooner than we think, I think.
Oakley?
No.
Oakley, and I'm with you on the no.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to see it, but no.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists.